Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to Madeleine, our parent and care educator who does webinars for us. I'm Carolyn Lancaster, the Children, Family and Youth Officer at Randwick City Council. We offer a free parenting calendar for anyone in the Randwick Council area or beyond. It's on our website. And one of our regular presenters is Madeleine. We're very lucky to have her teaching two seminars, whatever you want to call them, per every 6 months. So that's 4 a year, and they're completely free. We do record them, as you can see, and they're available on our YouTube channel. So if you want to see any past recordings, please go there to the Randwick City Council YouTube site, and you can look for Madeleine there and find her recordings. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we live and work on, the Bidjigal and Gadigal people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thank them for taking care of the land and the sea, which we are so lucky to have for our generation and for future generations. I'm going to hand it over to Madeleine in a moment, and she's going to explain the question and answer, but we'll be coming back on before the end of the session, and I'll be hosting the question and answer for Madeleine. So Madeleine, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm so pleased that you've made it and that you make the time to do this. Parenting's a busy job and it's hard to find the time. So welcome. I like to try to be inclusive. Do let me know if I've got this wrong. I'm language disabled and have to rely on Google Translate. So I too want to acknowledge country, show my respect to the traditional custodians on the land where I live and work, and to acknowledge that Indigenous culture survives and thrives, and that we have all gained from what they have lost. And before we begin, as with all webinars, you're on silent, and Carolyn is my assistant. We'll take questions at the end, and some of you did send me in some questions, so we'll see how we go. But even if you did send in a question, if you want to pop it in the Q&A and write your question, and Carolyn will read them out at the end, and if we have time, and we'll do our best to tackle them. But as you will hear me say a few times, I'm really happy to meet you. So do feel free to book a short free consultation with me, and I can get a little picture of your challenges, and I can point you in the direction of the most useful resources. This is an important place to start, which is the truth about you. Parenting's not easy, and we end up feeling bad about ourselves and about our parenting. And that's it's neither true nor is it helpful. In particular, it's not helpful. It's not a helpful place to go. So it's good to start with the truth about you, which is that you're a good parent, and that you truly, really have always done the very best that you can. If you could have done otherwise, you would have. Doubtless there are things that you would do differently, but if you could have done it differently, you would have. And that as a parent, you face real struggles and difficulties, and you're not to blame for these. You're parenting in an environment that doesn't make it easy, and doesn't prioritize parenting, and doesn't prioritize young people. And someday you'll get a little rest, as does my husband when we go to our friend's house where they have a very comfortable couch. So someday you'll get a little rest. I can guarantee you, it gets easier once they're 20. And then I think there's a whole bunch of other challenges. But anyway, after the webinar, I will send you a recording once it's up and some links to resources. I've pulled together a whole bunch of resources that you might find useful. And as again, you're welcome to book a short consultation with me if you haven't already done that. And I love to find out more about you. And you can find out more about Randwick Council, who kindly organise and manage the logistics of these events. They run a whole bunch of programs for children and families, and their YouTube channel, as Carolyn said, is worth a look. So my aim today is to help you prepare for, if you're not already there, you're probably already in the middle of it or at the beginning of it, the great shift into adolescence and parenting adolescence, but it's good to know what's coming. I'm hoping that the information I have today can help ease the way and help you stay connected through the teen years. A sense of connection is really one of the most important things, and there's a number of things that get in the way of that in general and in particular with our young ones. So I'm going to talk a bit about what's going on for our kids, but also what's going on for us at this stage of parenting. I think it's a little different. I also will give you some tips about building a sense of connection in your relationship with your teen, or your adolescent, which may be wearing a little thin, the sense of connection, and the way that you can offer it generally changes a bit as kids head into adolescence. I want to talk a bit about how important it is for us to both lighten ourselves and lighten up our family life, which is a huge relief to our young ones. And a sense of lightness and humour and play is lost increasingly as children get older, and it's actually not good for anyone. And I want to talk a little bit about handling upsets. So building connection is about adding credit to what I call our relationship bank account. And upsets generally use credit in our relationship bank account. So the project is really about managing that bank account. And the way you do that will shift depending on how old your child is. Just a little about me. I have done many different things. But the thing that matters most to me and turned out to be probably the most interesting is becoming a parent a little later than I might have. I didn't think I was going to do it, but I did, and it's the best thing that ever happened. Not easy, but the best thing that's ever happened. And I've been working with hand-in-hand parenting for over 30 years. Initially as someone interested in supporting families, then as a parent, and now as an instructor with them. They're based in the US and have instructors all over the world. And I was inspired to really begin teaching this in an organized kind of way, because even though I knew the approach really well, when I had a child, she knew what to do. I wasn't seeing anything that I couldn't make sense of in this model of how humans function. And that kind of was really reassuring. And the other thing that happens once you become a parent is that you inevitably and hopefully connect with other parents. And I found myself sharing this information, and it just made sense to get more organized around doing that. It's one of the things I most love to do. So just to explain hand-in-hand parenting a little, we work with a set of what we call listening tools, which are about balancing a sense of connection with the necessary corrections you need to make. So we often get very focused on the corrections, which is limit setting. But actually, it's as important to be focused on how strong your child's sense of connection is with you. And when you've got little kids, that can be challenging to think about because you're with them a lot. How come they don't feel connected? But there's all sorts of things that get in the way of a sense of connection. And indeed, as adolescence approaches, it that there's more going on that can get in the way of connection for us and for them. But we teach 3 listening tools that are about child-directed play to build your relationship and listening to upsets so that children really feel seen and heard. Those tools are special time, play listening, and stay listening. And we understand setting limits to be necessary when your children are not thinking, and they're usually not thinking because they're struggling with some emotional tension. So a lot of what happens around limit setting is that emotional tension is brought out into the open and can be resolved. So we can do that playfully, and I'm hoping later in the year to do a webinar on playful limit setting. It's really interesting. And we can set limits more firmly. There's a range of sort of firmness that we can use when we're setting limits. But at some point, there's usually an upset, and the listening tool that we teach is called stay listening, which is about hanging in there with the upset and trying to instead of trying to shut it down. It gets more challenging the bigger our kids get, but I'll talk a little bit about that. I call this the love triangle because at the base of the triangle, the foundation is the support that you get. It's a tremendously complex job, and in any other job that had this level of complexity, you would be well supported. You would have, ideally, you'd have supervision, you'd have colleagues, you'd have resources, you'd have training, and none of that happens. Or very little of that happens for most of us. I remember going to the prenatal classes a long time ago now, and realizing I didn't have a big family around me, so I didn't have a lot of contact with young ones. I remember holding this baby doll in my arms, as they give you this doll to teach you how to hold a baby, and realizing that I don't know when I'd last actually held a baby. So many of us come to it really not knowing much at all. I mean, then the difference between survival and non-survival is about 24 hours. We figure it out, the basics, fairly quick. But beyond that, it's a complicated project. And as I said before, my focus is on helping you understand the importance of this relationship bank account that you have in your relationship with your child. There's a whole series of relationships that are part of a family, and they intersect. And the bank account, for instance, that perhaps your parenting partner has with your child, you can borrow from that to some extent. If you need to set a limit and your closeness with your child isn't as it could be, but in general, each of the important people in your child's life really needs to have a relationship, be tending the relationship bank account in that relationship between the adult and the child. And in general, we find that where there are a lot of limits and struggles, that's a sign that there isn't enough. Basically, there's not enough money in the account. And if connection is the currency, so you're in debt if there's a whole lot of struggles and limits. If there's a sense of closeness and cooperation, generally that's a sign that your bank account's doing quite well. It's healthy. And the project is to sort of manage that balance. Again, there's a couple of different ways that we do that. when you've got struggles in your relationship with your child, basically their behavior is off track and unworkable and full of feelings. I like the language of off track and unworkable rather than bad, or, you know, they're not able to figure out what's going to make things go well. The definition of what makes things go well is perhaps to be negotiated, but in general, it's what they're doing isn't workable. It means they're full of feelings. And the first thing to kind of think about is how connected are they? So with older young people, we can generally hanging out is important. We may be able to use a listening tool of special time, which is a very specific, named, timed time between you and your child where you allow them to do whatever they want. There will be technicalities there that you might want to come and talk to me about, but that's the general impression, general idea. And play in general is important. On the other side, there are limits and listening. So sometimes when your kid's off track, you can try to connect, and that gets them back on the tracks. Sometimes that doesn't work to get them back on the tracks, but you'll need to bring some kind of limit, and then there may be an upset you need to listen to, and out of the other side of it comes someone who can think better. It's like there are two frameworks. One's a framework that's about appealing to reason, which is most of what's around in parenting advice. And the other is that what's getting in the way are feelings. We need to handle the feelings. And once we've handled the feelings, we can have a conversation that's based on we can assume that the person we're dealing with is more rational and they can reason and think. But expecting them to reason and think when they're off track is asking their brain to do something their brain can't do a lot of the time. So, and we're in this very special stage of parenting, joyful and challenging often. So it's not just teens. Adolescence, according to the research, is happening earlier and earlier. But at least by 12, your child is beginning, or probably reasonably well started on the process. And apparently, this process slows down significantly, and what is there is an adult brain by about 24. So it goes for much longer than traditionally we thought that it did. And in this process, what's happening for your child is that they're figuring out the whole world for a second time. So the early childhood is about getting information and understanding how the world works. And then what happens is a really profound process of pruning. It's a brain reconstruction, basically. And it seems like there's certainly hormonal stuff going on, but it's not all hormones. There's at least as much of it is about this process where neural pathways that have not been much used in childhood are pruned, and the ones that are being used are strengthened. And that's an incredibly demanding process. And I like Dan Siegel. You may come across him, and there are links to his work, in particular his videos, I think. His books are a bit wordy, but he likens it to a construction site rather than, like, your child is a construction site at this point. They're not a faulty building. So things may not be working because some parts come online that some other part hasn't quite got there yet to connect up with. But it's not that there's something fundamentally wrong most of the time. And if there is something fundamentally wrong, that will become clear. If you ever work with me, you'll find that's, I find myself often saying that to parents. It's like, we worry. Put someone in front of me who's worrying, chances are they're a parent. So we worry, but often the thing that we're worrying about, it will become clear that it's a problem that needs to be dealt with. We're often anticipating I call it the catastrophizing brain, but we're often anticipating dramas. And at this point right now, it's not clear that it isn't just that there's a construction site, not a big problem. In this process, Dan Siegel, he's a neuroscientist and psychiatrist, and he wrote a book called Brainstorm. He talks about the process that's going on for adolescents, which I find very useful. He calls it the essence of adolescence. He's pretty good at nice, cute little phrases. So that the ES in essence is emotional spark. So the brain reconstruction and the hormonal process means that a number of things are functioning differently at this point in life than they have been in early childhood, and then they will later. So emotional spark means there's an imbalance in the way the brain changes and develops, and that it's wired to flare into strong feelings. So if your child was pretty emotionally even before they headed into adolescence, you may find that they're much more inclined to flare up. And that's part of the process. And I'll say this a few times, but my general watchword is for us as parents is cheerfulness, which is not generally how we feel in the face of the flare of strong feelings and upsets. But I'll talk a bit more about that. The second thing that's really important to young people, the SE in essence, is social engagement. So our children are increasingly oriented to their peers. They still need us, and I will talk to you a bit about that. There's some research around that, but their connection with their friends and what's going on in their friendships is much more important than it was. And you aren't front and center in the same way that you were when you were younger. This can be a challenge for us to come to terms with, that where they're not so reassuring to us of how much we matter to them, if they were. Not all children are, but I used to certainly find that I felt like I was getting love for free. And that shifts a bit in adolescence. They still need you just as much, but it's in a different way. The other two things that are going on for an adolescent brain is the N in essence is novelty seeking. So they'll be looking for things which give them a dopamine rush, that are unfamiliar, unsafe, and they thrive on the uncomfortable in general. And there's an increased what they call reward drive, which is to do with trying to do things that give you that chemical injection, which is apparently dopamine. And connected with this, young people will have bad judgment about the risks and a positive bias in their thinking. So, Russian roulette, there's a 9 out of 10 chance it won't be whatever it is that comes up in Russian roulette. But the disastrous thing that happens that 1 in 10 times, they won't be looking at how disastrous it is in terms of their assessment of risk. They'll be looking at the 9 times when that won't happen. So that makes managing their decisions and their decision-making process a little bit challenging. The other thing young people at this stage are interested in is creative exploration, which is part of the sort of heading for things that are not familiar, new, different, imaginative, questioning, challenging the status quo. And yes, well, we're living in times where there are periods of history where the young people are demonstrating. This is one of them, I think. So, it's not unusual for universities full of later adolescents to be the hotbeds of political organisation and action, and they certainly are in the US. They may end up being here as well, but that's part of that process. In the face of all of this, our young people are not met. that don't walk into an easy environment. In general, adolescents get a bad rap. They're criticized for their reactiveness, for their explosiveness, for their risk taking. And we I don't think we work hard enough as a culture to find those good stories about young people. So they're walking into a bad reputation. And if you're in any group that's walking into a way of being seen by the world that's negative, that's not going to help you feel good about yourself and make good decisions. In general, young people really aren't respected. We do our best, but our systems are really not about consulting them about what they want. By the time they're in their teens, they've been in years of school, which even in the best school, is a place where they are being constantly told what to do, and it gets pretty wearing. One of the other things that happens is that as kids get bigger, we have greater expectations of them. And that's not a bad thing, but sometimes we get a little hoodwinked, and those expectations, we think because our children are bigger that they can handle more. And they generally can handle more, but it needs to be really carefully scaffolded. And that's the sort of unrealistic nature of some of the expectations are hard on adolescents. In general, there's a lot less play and much more seriousness as children move out of childhood and towards adulthood. I think it's a very sad thing about adulthood that it's such a serious business. Increasingly, it's not cool to give or receive simple affection. There's a lot of embarrassment that comes in. And, I remember early childhood being surprisingly physical, and that's human, and that gets trickier as our kids get older. If your children have come into adolescence with issues that didn't really get resolved in childhood, that will fuel the tightness of this period of parenting. The other really big thing that's going on is that in our culture, we're taught quite systematically not to express feelings in a way that will help us resolve them. And by the time you're a teen, it's gotten to be quite habitual, and adults are chronically in this place where we're basically bottling our feelings. And it can be socially because of the orientation to sort of our social connections as adolescents, showing your feelings can be socially quite risky. And we need to understand that as we try to move close to them. The other thing that I think must be incredibly hard is that our young people are looking to become adults in a world that's clearly in a mess. I mean, even worse in the last 2 years where there's wars all over the place. But climate change is not a fun fact. And I think young people these days many young people are aware of these huge problems, and it looks like they're not really getting tackled, and that's not an easy place to be. For us, we're in an interesting phase too. So we're no longer, I stuck to trying to deliver my daughter to school for as long as I could, because that time in the car is a really precious connecting time as the parent of an older child. But in general, we're not hanging around school. We're not dropping them off. They're often getting themselves there on their own. We're often shifting out of, if we haven't got much younger children, we're shifting out of that intensive parenting phase and looking forward to perhaps being able to invest more in other things like work. So we're generally more isolated in our parenting. We're a little bit tired after all these years of parenting without enough help. And I don't think, there's not many parents I've met who have anything close to enough help to make this a job that isn't just very taxing. We're pretty busy. As I said, we're often shift out of that intense early parenting phase and want to get on with other things and a bit distracted. As I said before, the expectations issue becomes complicated. We think because our kids are big that they are able. Sometimes they're as big as adults, and our brains aren't hugely smart in some ways, and we just assume that someone who's that big can look after themselves. And there certainly are expectations that are reasonable, but we have to be careful. The other challenge is that we were young once too, and one of the things about parenting is that it constantly brings us up against our own experiences of being parented, and we aren't always aware that that's happening. And adolescence in particular is a time where many of us were left alone for a whole bunch of reasons, and that's just what happened. People weren't tracking us as closely. We were navigating difficult and sometimes scary experiences. We may have had families or people around us who were really hard on us at this particular stage in parenting. And we carry those experiences. And when our children behave in certain ways, those memories flare, and with them come a big lot of feelings. And parenting's that's one of the conditions of parenting, is that we're constantly reminded, as I said, often not necessarily aware of it, but we're constantly reminded of our own struggles. And that gets in our way of telling what's actually going on now, and whether the issue is us or our child, or some combination of both. As I've already mentioned, we're a darling group of people, parents. I'm very fond of us as a group, but we do tend to worry, we catastrophize, and we tend to focus on the negative. And that really gets young ones down. Being met, worry feels so legitimate. And when our judgment is that they're in a situation they're not managing all that well, it's probably right. We're probably right. But being met with that at a point in your life where you're ready to start figuring out things for yourself, it's irritating for them. Then also, in navigating our relationship with our adolescent children, the history in your relationship will make a difference to how easy this phase is. If you've had a hard time up till now, I don't think in general it's going to get any easier. Yeah, for a number of reasons. So, one of the questions we need to ask is, how are things going for us? And how is our essence? How is our emotional spark, sensory exploration? Was it sensory? Novelty seeking, and creative exploration. It's hard on young people. It feels, we're busy trying to earn a living, and that's a serious business. But a lack of that kind of zest and joy is hard on young people. So get on the swing with this guy. Because our young ones actually want the best for us. And Ellen Galinsky is a researcher. It's a little bit old now, but it's worth looking up. She did some research, conducted over 1,000 interviews with families. And out of that, she says, even more than the desire to spend more time with their parents, and that's paramount, young people want their parents to be less stressed and less tired. They want the best for us. And we do need to spend some time, easier said than done, trying to find our sparkle. And again, Dan Siegel in the book Brainstorm, he says, what adolescents have going for them that's both a challenge and a gift is actually what adults need in order to maintain vitality in their lives. So it's worth noticing the times that you feel connected, you feel open, you feel pleased, and you feel relaxed. As I said, easier said than done. So now on to the project of our relationship with our adolescent children. Connection and a sense of connection with the people who are important in our lives is a deep, deep, deep human need. And where that connection is broken, we don't function well. So lonely people don't function well. And when we feel well-resourced and cared about and connected with the people around us, we can learn well. We can use our what you might call our rational mind. We can use our thinking brain. And, if you've got teens, you've probably waded through a fair bit of the school system. The difference that it makes to have a teacher who can express caring is profound. And it's just a little example of how much the relationship affects what can happen and how people can use their brains. So your job is to stay connected to your young people, but the way you do it is changing. So when they're little, and you can see this in what happens around the listening tool of special time, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But basically, when you offer a young one special time, generally they're pretty damn happy to drop whatever they're doing and do special time with you. At that point in early childhood, you're the sun around which your children orbit. And what you're in the middle of is a role that's changing to something like, to use a heating analogy, you're the heater in the room. They'll notice you when you aren't there. But if you do a whole lot of drawing attention to yourself, you'll find that it doesn't really work all that well. So you may rock up to them using the listening tool of special time as an example, a one-on-one, very deliberate time of paying attention to your child. You may rock up and offer that to them, and they may turn you down. And that's because they can't connect with such a direct approach anymore. But they desperately need you. They need the room to be warm. So that's what your job is. The way that you can keep the room warm is to prioritize hanging out, to make yourself available. So you might take up something that means that you're around, but that your attention's not fully taken up with it. So you're interruptible. They will come and get you if they find the door open. You need to not have a whole bunch of agendas for the time that you spend with your young person. And that certainly I'm finding in, like, my daughter's nearly 20. At this point, that requires that I really do prioritize the times where we can hang out where there isn't an agenda, because it's easy to have agendas. You've got to catch that train on time. You've got to get to work. I mean, those are the agendas that are happening now. You need to find times where there's no other place you really have to be. Low intensity family time really gets important. And I know that parents of young ones often worry about dinner time. And in general, young kids have a bit of trouble with formal dinner times. But the research suggests that the ritual of dinner time, low intensity family time, so long as dinner time's not full of a whole lot of tension, which it can be, especially if we're channeling what happened to us around more formal dinner times. But anyway, sharing food together on a regular basis and everyone getting a chance to check in turns out to be really incredibly useful in terms of maintaining a sense of connection. What you're going to need to do is really resist making comment about the things that aren't going right unless they're really important. And important means there's a safety issue, basically. You want to try and find the positive things and bring attention to those. And when you do need to set a limit, especially the low level limits, the places where you're inclined to have to remind them, and it may be that it's necessary for you to remind them of something, their brain isn't well organized. But if you're anything other than cheerful, what you're doing is bringing your agenda into the issue. Now, the fact that you're doing a whole lot of work and really they're pretty grown up and maybe they ought to be able to do it, all of that, is true, really. But the reality is that they're not doing it, and they may need a reminder, and your job is to cheerfully remind them. Yeah. The challenge of setting more firm limits around safety issues. Cheerfulness is probably a pretty good byword. So our young ones, they want the best for us and they want the best of us. So in the interviews that Ellen Galinsky did with these young people, they said things like, your friends can be there for you, but it's really your parents, particularly when you're older and you have bigger problems, it's your parents who are really important to be there for you. And this young person observes, when we're so busy pushing our parents away, that's when we really want them. And it's hard to ask. And about hanging out, I'm more comfortable if my parent just notices there's something wrong and says it, because I find it hard to break that barrier. So we get a bit scared of moving in, and I think it's important to understand they need us to move in, but it needs to be not full of worry, catastrophizing, etc. And I don't know if I say this here, but one of the things I think we really need to be not take personally is grumpiness. It's basically, as we move towards them, because that's what needs to happen, they will tend to look like we're bothering them. And that's not actually a sign there's anything wrong. You just need to stay cheerful in the face of it. As I love foul language comics. I think they're wonderful. He has a lot to say about parenting, and I quite like this one. So, twin translator, grunt means thank you, as always, for all your trouble. So we have to assume that they need us and want us, even if it looks a little bit grumpy. So special time with teens is about building connection credits in your relationship bank balance. So in general, the special time, like proper, it's a time which is announced. It's timed so that your child and you both know how long it's going to last. And that's a lot of what gives it helps it to work to build emotional safety into your relationship with your child. And it's regular. It's one adult to one child in general. And you basically say to your child, I'll do whatever you want to do. That's the general principle. It's very rare for it not to work well that way with younger children. And with our older children, it's still really important to take that attitude. It's about creating a space where they can tell us things. And when we're not going to overwhelm them with how we feel about those things or what we think about those things, there's a space for them to communicate with us, and it may not happen through words. With little children, it tends to happen through play. But it's time where there's one-on-one time. Your child needs time with you where they don't have to compete with their siblings or with your work or with your phone. It needs to be where you decide not to be distracted, and you want to let them lead. You want to let them tell you what they want to do. And in this time, you need to do it willingly and be delighted with your child at this time. There'll be some things they want to do which aren't workable, and it's good, if you're giving this a go, to come and check in with me, and I can help you figure out, okay, how do we navigate this? But in general, this needs to be your general approach. And what you don't want to do in this time with your young person is bring up sore subjects. Use it, take advantage of the closeness to try to start having a conversation about how come they don't wash their dishes, whatever. Or how come they're not getting to school or whatever. You don't want to take over. You need to let them be the competent one, the knowledgeable one, and you don't want to ask prying questions, pass judgment, or refer to difficulties about in your life or their life. This is just about really hanging out together. One of the things, as I said, when you offer this to older young people, often they'll turn you down. And there's a few things going on there. One is that they may have their own agendas. And part of what happens as your children get older is that you need to know, they need to be able to push back and have things a bit more on their terms than they needed to be able to do when they were younger. Secondly, when you move towards your child, they're going to feel things. And when you're an adolescent, you've learned on pain of social death not to show those feelings. So having someone who around whom you feel safe, offer themselves and their time, can sometimes bring up a bunch of feelings that an adolescent doesn't want to feel. And so then it looks like you're bothering them. And sometimes you just have to get through that scratchy bit. The other thing is that I think one of the most important things, I don't know if I talk about this later, is that you watch very closely for where they invite you in. That's like gold. So something where they want to show you or share something with you, or they start to talk about things. Usually, I said driving in the car is a place where there's something about your attention being on the driving and not directly on them that often makes it a space where they can bring up subjects to talk about that they might not otherwise bring up. You want to take that as gold, where a child brings topics up or asks you what you think about their music or invites you in some way. And sometimes those little invitations can be quite small. You really want to keep your eye out for them. Then you need to drop what you're doing basically quietly, not bring attention to yourself, but drop what you're doing and understand that right now what you need to pay your child is special time, attention that's of the quality of special time. You probably won't be able to announce it. You might be able to organize, a special day out or something like that with an older young person. But announcing it often doesn't work, but moving in alongside them and adjusting your step effectively to theirs, that's special time. Don't answer your phone. So, and in general, what we're wanting to do is, wherever we can, putting deposits in the connection bank account. I don't know that I said this, but I actually think that the brain reconstruction that's going on in an adolescent brain is incredibly demanding. And in fact, the level of connection, the base level connection in your relationship with them will be lower. So you need to, there's some things you may need to give up, which worked fine when they were younger, but generally understand that you need to eliminate the negative. You need to emphasize the positive. If they could, they would. You need to do cheerful limit setting, and you need to pick your fights and save firmer limit setting for issues that are around safety. You don't want to use up all your credit nagging them about the fact that they're not cleaning up their room or some other thing you'd like them to do. And I can tell you, with a big person in the house who doesn't do that, it's incredibly irritating. But if that's where your attention is too much of the time, you're not going to have credit in the bank when you really need it. No, sweetheart, I'm not giving you the keys to the car. And then there's a big explosion. You need good credit there. So it's about thinking about that. So you want to give up negative comments reflecting disappointment in them about their appearance, their clothing, their friends, their TV, their food choices, their electronic habits. Electronic habits is a huge source of challenge for all of us, and in particular for in parents' relationships with young people. But I could do a whole webinar on that. You want to give up giving unsolicited advice or opinions. By the time they're 12, 13, 14, 15, they've had a hell of a lot of advice from adults. And it is often not adjusted for where they're at, and they're tired of it. You need to ask interested questions, but don't pry. They need to be able to figure things out for themselves. And if you're upset, it's good to try and avoid offloading negative feelings with your child, and try and avoid taking it personally. I think they're in a construction zone. That said, if you're building enough credit in your relationship and they do something that really sends you nuts and you get angry and you express that, I don't think that's the end of the earth. This is not about perfect parenting, but it's about balancing things out. So you can be real with them, but you need to make sure that there's times where they know you're on their side so that you get through those difficult moments without damaging your relationship with them. I got a bit fancy here, I think. So in terms of lightening up, you need to focus on what they're doing well, on what makes them feel happy and alive, and encourage them to do more of that. You really want to make it possible for there to be a playful times. I've never been much good at play, so that's a challenge for me, all the time. And when your preteen asks for your attention or your teen asks for your attention, stop and pay attention. And when they invite you in, take up their offer. It's gold. It's got extra bonus points because they initiated it. And in general, along with being cheerful and probably connected to it, is preparedness to not take yourself so seriously, to send yourself up. It's such a relief. Adults are so serious, and it just wears kids out. So anytime we can kind of admit our faults cheerfully, make fun of ourselves, not sound like we know everything, it's going to be useful in terms of building credit in your relationship. So around setting limits, as I've said, We need to give up sweating the small stuff and really pick your battles. Your principles need to be that your child is safe and happy and well. And the rest of it really isn't that important. It will get better if it's hard now. They will figure out how to manage themselves. You need to drop nagging. It really doesn't work. It's this weird thing where we keep doing the same thing over and over, even though it's clear it doesn't work. Like, you may be perfectly right that they need to clean their room, or that they need to get up earlier, or they need to go to bed earlier, go to bed earlier. But you need to stop doing what doesn't work. You want to be careful about supervising daily tasks. You may need to be the alarm clock. They're going to have often trouble getting organized, but your job is just to be the cheerful reminder and really get any tone of resentment out of that job. And it's not useful to set up rewards or punishments. If this is something that is tricky for you to think about, come and see me. But basically, setting up rewards and punishments assumes that in the heat of the moment, your child will either be able to remember the agreement that's been made. It's often not an agreement, but will be able to get themselves organized around working towards a reward, or will care about it. And the problem is that once someone's in a bad spot, they are already not thinking, and they either won't be able to remember what they're supposed to be doing or what horrible thing might happen to them. They're just acting on how they're feeling right now. And either that, or they won't care. That dealing impulsively with what they want to, heading in the direction they think they want to head in now, isn't it? The fact that some thing might happen that's bad as a consequence doesn't really help. They may not care about it. There are ways of setting limits that can look like a reward or a punishment, but it's a different framework. It's about giving kids the scaffolding they need, and listening to their upsets so that they can think well. And in general, we need to take the attitude that if they could, they would. That's why nagging doesn't work. Feelings get in the way of thinking. We need to set warm limits and relaxed high expectations. I love that. And when we do that, often feelings will come up for them, and we need to be prepared to listen to them. When we have to set limits, we need to understand that it uses up connection credit in our relationship, and we will have, no matter how serious the situation is, we need to be keeping our eye on opportunities to build connection credits. And expectations are important. If they work as a kind of limit in a way, something towards which a child can work that may be something they have to push against in order to achieve. But the combination of expectations and support is what makes for progress. Expectations on their own often aren't well enough supported, and young people need a lot of support. That they don't know enough about the world to navigate it without your help, but they need a scaffold and they need a scaffold. I love this idea of relaxed high expectations, because mostly we were met with tense high expectations or tense low expectations ourselves. And it's quite a challenge to hold out that something's possible, and stay cheerful about it and figure out how to be encouraging without nagging. So just to get to the thing that will happen at some point is that you'll get in the way of your child enough, and that may be in a productive way and it may be in a not so productive way, but you'll get in the way enough that basically feelings become available. So if your child doesn't have a strong sense of connection with you, or something's happened that just breaks their sense of connection with things being good, um, that is a source of emotional tension for them. And feelings will come up and they're in their feeling brain. Stressful experiences from the past contribute to that emotional tension. We call it an emotional backpack. Feelings tend to migrate and they snowball and they drive off track behavior. A friend of mine once had a child who was really, really, really scared of cats. And then some months later, I met him and he said, "Oh, now we can't eat outside because she's really scared of birds." It's like that's a classic example of the way a little knot of fear, when every time it comes up, it gets stuck on something else and it tends to snowball. We need to keep in mind that part of what our children are expressing is how hard it is to be young, how difficult it is to be in a situation where you don't have a lot of control over what's going on. You're met with a lot of negativity often. And our children, when they're little, this is easier to understand, but pretty well all human beings, adults as well, tend to have big feelings about little things. So when they're little, it's kind of sometimes they'll present it as such a tiny little sort of hiccup that we can tell that it must be about something else. But often those things about which your adolescent child is having an upset, they will be actually standing in for some other thing which is really giving them trouble. You may not ever know what that is, but you can assume that. I mean, in general, that's what happens with young people. They'll pick what we call pretexts and sometimes almost set up an upset to have a big upset about some little thing. Add to that the sort of emotional volatility that comes with this big brain reconstruction that's going on. It's going to be a time of big feelings. And you requiring that they stop showing those feelings doesn't actually make them go away. It just tends to make them go underground. It is much harder to handle. It's much harder to handle the big feelings as our kids get bigger because they're just bigger and stronger. And there's some judgments you're going to need to make there. But having a bit of a grizzle, having a bit of a cry, etc., is in fact the pathway to things going better. So you need to expect upsets. When you set a limit, what you're doing is interrupting. So here's the off-track behavior, here's the limit. You interrupt it with the limit and the feelings bubble up. Forgive my gloves. And those upsets are necessary. They're part of how we offload the tension that we're carrying so that we can think better. Getting to offload that will generally be a pathway to better cooperation. I don't know what I mean by a badge of honor. That you're being targeted is actually a sign that your child feels safe enough to point her difficulty in your direction because she's hopeful that you'll be able to handle it. So it's a badge of honor that your child is being mean to you. The other thing is that when someone's upset in a way that looks sort of like fighting, and there's a fair bit of that, it's sort of scrappier, more physical, crankier in general as kids move into adolescence. it's what that process is about a feeling of being overpowered and a need to feel strong, either physically and or metaphorically, like have a strong relationship to it. So to fight against a feeling of fear is going to come out looking like defiance, but it's actually an important process in being able to process that. It's an important part of being able to process that feeling of fear. And you're going to need help in this process. You're going to need to find someone to talk to about it. We recommend listening partnerships. One of the things about listening partnerships, you can make your friends into your listening partners, but you need to be really careful to set it up formally. So what makes a listening partnership safe is confidentiality. One of the things that happens as our kids get older and their struggles get bigger and more socially scary is that we worry about telling people what's going on because we're frightened of being judged and we're frightened of our children being judged. And we need to get help, but we also just need a place where we can download about how difficult it is to stay cheerful, partly. So listening to feelings is pretty much the same at any stage. There, as I said, there's more fight and struggle, I think, in the way feelings come out in the adolescent years, and partly that's because our culture really supports the squashing down of feelings. So by the time you're in adolescence, you've got really good at that, and it doesn't feel safe to show your feelings. So they're up against that. But releasing tears release stress and grief. Tantrums, which don't have a good rap in our culture, they're actually the normal human process of releasing frustration. They're how we get rid of a sense of frustration. And they're generally short and fast, and then things look different. Laughter is incredibly powerful and often easier to reach and to get to in your relationship with your child. Laughter heals fears, lighter fears and embarrassments. And by this stage, you're probably getting a fair bit of it's not fair, some version or other. And actually, a lot of it isn't fair. And a sense of righteous indignation, of standing up for what's right, of defending yourself against unfair criticism, that's an important explosion of feeling. It may be hard to listen to, but it's actually an important process. And being able to do that, I have a friend who said that their dinner time, sort of somewhere around 13, involved a lot of complaining about what was going on at school and what wasn't right about what was going on at school. And my friend said, I'm glad I knew this, because she needs to be able to say somehow, somewhere, this isn't right, and say that and be heard. Sometimes you need to step in and help them correct it, but sometimes just what's needed is to be able to say, this isn't fair. That makes it possible to go back into that situation and handle it well, even though it's an environment that's not that fair. But being able to do all those things restores thinking and a sense of connection. So when your teen is upset, you need to remember you're the safety manager. They're not thinking once they're in the middle of an upset. You need to stay as close as you can. Someone asked me a question in the registration process about what do I do when they slam the door? And I think, you're the safety manager. Don't get your hand caught in the door. Stay as close as you can. If it means sitting on the other side of the door and passing notes under the door at some point, that's stay as close as you can while maintaining things safely. you need to understand that when someone is really upset, they will tend to say things that they don't mean. We call it freedom of the mouth, and it's where you really need to put a box around the time when they're upset and understand that what they are saying in the middle of that upset is not what they mean. It's a badge of honor. They're targeting you because you're safe to say it. You need connected with that, not to take it personally and not to jump in and fix it. I'm certainly finding, with a 20-year-old, I really am noticing the degree to which that wanting to fix things is so instinctual, and she does not want it. She'll ask. She'll ask if she really wants me to help. And I chronically, it's a struggle to shift out of that early parenting stage where you would just automatically fix things up. But you may not need to fix it. It may fix itself, or they may figure it out. I think you need to understand that loud noises and strong words, slamming doors, as well as quiet tears, that's all the expressions of feeling. Sometimes powerful, but that's because the feeling that's underneath is threatening to overwhelm them. You need to keep things safe. It can be complicated, but just because they're not sitting on your lap having a nice little sob doesn't mean that there's not a useful process going on. And it's important to understand that, and our culture is very confused about this, but to stop the expression of upset, the crying, sometimes the laughing. Kids will laugh when they're scared, which is why they laugh when they're in trouble. So stopping the laughing or the crying or whatever it is that's going on, it actually doesn't stop the feeling. It just sends it underground. And sometimes we need to decide that we're going to help the people we love deal with the feelings that are giving them trouble. And you're going to need support and assistance in this process. You're going to need a place where you can get listened to. And a cool thing is to exchange listening time with another parent. It's useful for you to talk about your own stories as an adolescent. That will affect very profoundly how you respond to your child. We kind of breathed it in, even if it wasn't kind of violent and abusive. We breathed it in, and we kind of breathe it out, and half the time we're not even aware of it. So just telling the stories of what it was like for you as a teenager, it actually can be a really sweet experience to remember those times. It's useful for you to have a place where you can blow off steam and kind of unload your own emotional tension, and you gain perspective on things once you've managed to process some of the feelings that go with it. So I recommend listening partners. I have a page on my website that is a little cheat sheet. By the way, this is my husband, a lot younger, and my daughter, a lot younger. And if you've got questions, do feel free to get in touch with me. I'd love to see if I can help. So I'll quickly do this just to tell you that I like to acknowledge the artwork of the people who've taken the time to put their photos up on the web, and so I can use them. So very much appreciation to the artists in the world. So I might see if there's...
We do have a question, Madeleine.
Okay, all right. Okay.
What if tantrums and outbursts and tears become a habit?
Come and talk to me, I think I would say. I think it can be, what I would say is most of us didn't have anyone who was prepared to listen to us much as at all as young people, and particularly if we were upset or there was strong feeling involved. And so we have limited patience for other people who are upset. And I just don't think there's any way that you can require that someone stop being upset. I think what you need to do is get better at listening to the upset, and then on the other side of that, finding times where you're well connected in order to be able to try and have a conversation about what that upset is about. But I'm not sure that it's useful to label them as a habit, or, I mean, one of the traps we get into as parents is that we're being manipulated. You know, my child's manipulating me. And sometimes the way that an emotional struggle turns up can look like you're being manipulated, but ultimately it's actually your child asking for help. It's just difficult to really it's a challenge to figure out how to respond in a way that's useful. So I think if you've got to that point, you're welcome to come and have a chat with me. The other thing I would say is, in general, if you've got enough of a focus, it can be difficult if things have gotten into trouble in your relationship with your adolescent child. It's difficult to figure out how to lift it out of that trouble. But in general, if there's enough connection credit in the relationship bank account, you should find that the upsets are less frequent. And if there's a lot going on, there's probably there's possibly a few things going on. So you may need to sort out if there's some current point of tension that's causing the difficulty. Children sometimes will come and tell us this happened or this is happening, but they don't always. Sometimes it comes out in upsets or in crappy behavior, and we need to be prepared to sort of work with them to build connection, to get information. Yeah. Feel free to come and see me if that's where you're at. Okay.
Okay, so we have one other question, and please feel free. We have a few more minutes left, another 10 minutes if you have any more questions. Here's the next one. What should we do if there is a friend with different values and is being mean and said in social media, sorry, just the punctual, sorry.
Yeah.
And said in social media, they do not want to be friends with my daughter. And then a month later, they want to be friends again. Is it okay to cut off this play date with someone who is mean to my daughter?
I I'm just about writing an article which will come out in my next newsletter about just this. Social media is hugely challenging. The ease with which things can be done digitally rather than how difficult it's easier to be mean to someone or to build closeness, on the other hand, with someone through sort of social media or texting or whatever, and then it would be if you were dealing with that relationship face to face. And that, I think, is something we have to stay close by our children as they navigate. It's one thing to have nasty stuff happening on social media, but I've also watched while young people develop closeness through texting that actually isn't representative of how close the relationship really is. So it's challenging. So I'm not going to talk about social media. It's difficult and complicated, and we're all struggling with it. But what I will say is, I think our job at this point is to be available to make enough times where we're not preoccupied with something else and there's an opportunity for our child to tell us what's going on for them. That is super, super important. And at this stage in particular, we need to, there may be circumstances where you need to get help in order to isolate your daughter from that person. It probably is going to take more than just cutting off from social media. But at this point, we don't have the kind of control over our children's social relationships that we had when they were younger, and we will feel the intense sort of inclination to move in and try and fix it up for them. And at this point, we really need to stand back and listen and wait and see what happens and be there. And sometimes we will need to move in to give them a hand. I mean, and there will be other people we can ask for help in that process. The other thing is schools are, if your kid is at school, if difficulties have arisen, I think it's always useful to touch base with school teachers about stuff. They're dealing with young people at this stage all the time, and they're they may have some useful perspectives, and there may be stuff they can support you to do or that they can step in and do. But the main message I would have at this stage is be available, listen. As I say in this article, if at all humanly possible, say nothing. Because as soon as you express your agenda, your child is going to move away from you on that topic. There may be a point at which you need to say, look, I think you need to cut this relationship off, but I wouldn't be moving in too fast. She needs to figure it out for herself, and it may all end in tears, or there may be something much more serious going on around the social media that needs a more serious intervention, but that will become clear. But you really, we have to really accept that we've shifted out of that phase where our children's friendships were largely determined by who we decided we were going to spend time with, and that's no longer the case. And it's a little bit excruciating. So I hope that's helpful.
Okay, we've got 2 more questions and we only have about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
Someone has written in saying, how do we deal with sexuality? It's probably totally outside the scope of this webinar.
I think it is. What I would say, though, is that it's connected to an idea that I think it's been floating around. I haven't said. We did not get listened to as young people. So we, as parents, have a lot of trouble understanding how incredibly powerful that resource is because we didn't experience it ourselves. So listen, listen, listen is what I would say. And the other thing is that the whole topic of sex is one that most of us have a lot of our own feelings about, and that it's going to be really important to find a place where you can work through where you're at and what your experiences were. It's not that there isn't stuff you can do around a child expressing how they want to be in the world sexually, but it's a tricky topic for many of us adults, and my advice would be to find a way to do the work you need to do on your story there, and that will make it easier to figure out what to do. But beyond that, I'm not going to say more.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Is it okay to let my child have a personal mobile phone at the age of 12 or 16 years? What should we do as a parent? As I have financial hardships at the moment, a lot of us are in this boat. Yeah. Please advise. Thank you. That's a great question.
It is a really good question. And the whole thing about phones is a topic in itself. However, I'd say that at 12, you probably need to be able to contact your child and they need to be able to contact you. So I'd be considering getting a phone that has very limited function at that point. They're probably not really old enough to navigate stuff on their own. You know, I'm not sure, but that's an option, I think. I think needing to be able to contact you and you needing to be able to contact them is actually a real need. And when I was young, I mean, it was tricky, but you could find a phone booth to do it. There are no phone booths anymore. So at 16 and old, and I mean, anything even somewhere between 12 and 16, I think we have to have a good relationship and be connected with our children, have some way of monitoring without spying. It's not straightforward, is what I would say. But I think what we need to be very careful of is assuming that we know best, and that it isn't, in fact, incredibly important socially for them to be connecting with their friends via their phone, however that happens. So it's not straightforward, but we tend in general as parents to get very worried about it. And I think we do need to keep our eye on it, but we need to understand that that way of communicating is essential socially in a way that it wasn't when I was young. I mean, I'm 60, so, but even, I mean, what is it? Mobile phones have been really full on since about 2012. So most of us were much younger. Most of us grew up without them, and our way of connecting with our friends didn't involve that. And we need to be careful not to assume that the way we did it is realistic for our children now. So I think, yeah, it's a challenge. People advise, the advice is generally, keep it out of the bedroom at night. I think if you're going to do that, if you can get that happening initially when the phone is introduced, you've got a better chance. I think your chance of setting those kind of firm guidelines around it once the enemy's already entered the household and is embedded, then it's much harder. But to reassure you, this is an area that almost every parent is struggling with, and it's not your fault that it's tricky, if that makes sense. Yeah. And there's no miracle cure. In general, there's no miracle cure. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Madeleine.
My
We did have
pleasure.
a final question. Someone had a hard time coming on,
Oh,
and I did say that everyone who's attending will get the recording sent out as soon as it's on the Randwick YouTube channel. Madeleine will send out an email to all participants. Your email will not be shared with anybody else. It'll be a blind carbon copy, and we do not share that list with anybody else. Madeleine can give you more details about the free session with her, the 20-minute parenting session. Someone had also asked, is there ongoing parent groups? The parenting calendar that we put out has a list of organisations that do run ongoing free parent and carer classes. There are also free play groups in the area. There's the Southeastern Community Centre in Mascot. They run play groups in Randwick too, Randwick Council area. There's Botany Family and Children's Centre. There's the Junction Neighbourhood Centre. There's Karitani. I don't know if Karitani runs a free play group, but SEC does, SECC. And what I can do is give Madeleine the parenting calendar for this 6 months, and it has the details of those organisations on there. A new calendar will be coming out in July for the next 6 months, and you can find out more about parenting classes and webinars there of different kinds. So, Madeleine, did you want to say anything before you closed up?
no, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you
And
everyone for
get
coming.
company. So do feel free to get in touch.
Okay, I'm not going to close it out because there's one more question down the bottom. Oh, just a thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, great. And
Cool.
Madeleine, you'll have Madeleine's email and you can be in
Yeah.
touch with her too.
Good.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.